Chapter 1. The night express. The November fog draped the Kalala platform like a damp veil, muting the usual clamor of passengers boarding the midnight express to London. I pulled my overcoat tight against the Channel's chill and hastened along the carriages, my breath puffing into small clouds under the amber glow of the station lamps, the promise of a warm sleeping berth and a steaming hot toddy in the dining. Car had carried me through a dreary business conference in Paris, and I was eager to settle in for the night crossing, matching my astonishment. Then, when I found the compartment next to mine already occupied by none other than my old friend, Hercule Poirot, Mon Ami Hastings. His familiar voice rang with its usual note of pleased satisfaction. But how delightful. Poirot has been hoping for agreeable company on this journey. Good Lord. Poirot, I exclaimed, setting down my valise with perhaps more force than intended. What brings you aboard? I thought you were in Belgium visiting your nephew. A friend stepped from his compartment with that precise, almost mechanical grace I knew so well. Even at this late hour, his appearance was impeccable, not a hair of his meticulously waxed mustache out of place, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the platform's dampness. Ah, but the family visit, he said, adjusting his tie with characteristic fastidiousness. It concluded most satisfactorily yesterday, and now Poirot returns to London with, how do you say, renewed vigor for the little problems that await him. I settled into my own compartment, grateful for the plush furnishings of the first-class carriage. Through my window, I glimpsed the last stragglers hurrying aboard, their forms ghostly in the swirling mist. The train carried that peculiar hush of night travel soft voices, the gentle click of closing doors, and an air thick with anticipation, the sense of a small world preparing to hurtle through darkness toward dawn. I say, it's rather atmospheric tonight, isn't it? I remarked, loosening my collar roll. This fog and mystery, quite like something from one of those detective novels. Mrs. Oliver, writes Poirot's eyes, twinkled with amusement. Indeed, mon amour, but perhaps tonight, Mosfear, she is more than mere coincidence. He moved to his window and peered out aft platform. Sir, if you please, the passengers who board with us following his gaze. I watched a small cluster of travelers making their way along the corridor outside our compartments. A distinguished gentleman with a Germanic bearing supervised the loading of what appeared to be specimen cases. A professor of some sort, a judge behind him. A woman of middle years moved with the purposeful stride of one accustomed to managing household affairs. Her traveling coat, practical but well made. That fellow looks like an academic, I observed, probably heading to one of the London universities. Precisimo, Professor Otto Lindemann, if labels on his cases are to be believed, a botanist returning from research. In the Mediterranean Pure's tone held that particular note of interest that I had learned to recognize over the year, saying the lady. I studied the woman more carefully. She had paused near our carriage checking her ticket against the number on her door in the lamplight, caught a glimpse of steel gray hair beneath a sensible hat, and a face that spoke of authority, tempered by kindness, a governess perhaps, or a companion to some elderly relative, Miss Agatha Winters. Poirot murmured, somehow having acquired this information in his mysterious way. A lady of independent means, traveling alone to London on personal business. To trains whistle gave a preliminary shriek, and the last passengers quickened their pace mark. Then I noticed a young woman who moved with a different quality, altogether a quiet grace that seemed almost fragile in the harsh station. Lighting, she carried herself with careful dignity, her dark traveling dress unadorned, save for a small locket. That caught the light as she turned to climb the steps to our carriage. Now, there's a rather striking young lady, said, then caught myself. I mean to say, she has an interesting face, rather sad. Wouldn't you say Pooh had followed my gaze? and was studying the young woman with that peculiar intensity he reserved for puzzles that particularly intrigued him, Miss Annabella Lay. He said softly, "And yes, mon ami, there is indeed something of sadness about her. But also," he paused, his head tilted slightly to one side, "also something of purpose, a resolution perhaps, that has been long in the formant, seemed to know a great deal about our fellow passengers already." I remarked half, "You've been conducting investigations at the station, merely the observations that any man of intelligence might." Hercule Poirot replied with his characteristic modesty that was not modest at all. "The labels on the luggage, the manner of dress, the small details that speak so eloquently of character and circumstances." Final whistle echoed across the platform, sharp and commanding. Door slammed with military precision, and the great iron beast began its slow departure from Kalama. The fog swirled past our windows as we gathered speed, and the lights of the port town gradually faded into the darkness. Behind us, I settled back in my seat, already feeling the rhythm of the rails beginning to work its soporific magic. Well, whatever little dramas you'll be detected among our companions, I suspect they'll keep until morning. Nothing like a good night's sleep on a train tourist door. Once prospective Poirot remained at his window, watching the French countryside slip past in the darkness, his reflection in the glass held that familiar expression of deep thought, the look of a man whose little gray cells had detected something that required careful consideration. Train's whistle echoed once more through the night, a lonely sound that seemed to carry with it all the mystery and possibility of the journey ahead. Chapter 2. A Mockingbird. Silence. Chapter 2. A mockingbird silenced Teedy, awoke to the gentle, rocking motion of the train in the pale light of dawn filtering through my compartment window. Fog of the previous evening had lifted, revealing the rolling English countryside, rushing past in shades of amber and gold. We had crossed the channel during the night, and I felt that particular satisfaction that comes from waking in one's homeland after foreign travel, the rhythmic clatter of wheels. On-rails had settled into a comforting pattern, and I was contemplating whether to ring for early tea when a sharp cry framed the corridor, shattered the morning tranquility. "Monsieur, Miss Bennet, something terrible." "Oh, Monsieur." I threw on my dressing gown and hurried from my compartment to find a young attendant standing frozen outside one of the sleeping berths further down the carriage. His face had gone quite pallid. His hands trembled as he pointed toward the partially open door. "What's the matter, my good fellow?" I said. A cold presentiment was already settling in my stomach. Before the attendant could reply, Poirot appeared at me elbow, with that uncanny ability of his to materialize precisely when circumstances required his presencia. Was already fully dressed, his appearances immaculate, as if he had spent the morning at his twilight redon aboard a moving train. "Ah, Hastings," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the attendant's stricken face. "It would appear that our journey has taken an unexpected turn." The young man, Ori, according to his name badge, managed to stammer out his discovery. "The lady in compartment 7, Massey. She does not respond when I knock for morning tea service." The door, it was not reportedly latched, and when I looked inside, he shuddered and crossed himself. Poirot moved past him with swift purpose, and I followed, my heart sinking as I recognized the compartment. This was where the quiet young woman with the locket had retired the previous evening. Miss Annabel Lee, the sight had greeted us, was both peaceful and profoundly disturbing. Miss Lee lay in her narrow berth, her dark hair arranged neatly on the pillow, her hands folded to crats, her chest with an almost ritualistic precision. Her face bore an expression of such serene repose that one might have thought her merely sleeping, were it not for the unmistakable stillness that spoke of death. "Pulver, Petty." Poole murmured, stepping carefully into the small space. His eyes moved systematically around the compartment, taking in details with that peculiar intensity I had observed so many times before. Ori, you have touched nothing. No, Miss Shaw. I see she does not move. Call out, and then I fetch you trivia. Now you must find the conductor at once. Tell him, there's been a death, and he must notify the authorities in London. But first, Poirot's gaze sharpened first. He will allow no one else to enter. This compartment person, you understand me, nodded vigorously and hurried away. His footsteps echoing down the corridor. Found myself studying the peaceful scene with growing uneasy. Appears to have died. Quite naturally, I observed heart failure. Perhaps just seemed rather delicate last evening. Indeed, mon ami, the appearance is most convincing. Poirot bent closer to examine the deceased. Woman's hands, his movements, careful and precise. But observe, if you please, what do you notice about Mademoiselle? Late this morning, that was not so last evening. Studied the still form more carefully, trying to recall my glimpse of her on the platform. She's not wearing her locket, that rather distinctive piece with the paused. The significance striking. Me, good Lord Poirot, it's gone entirely prosy. Zimmet, his fingers hovered over the woman's neck, where a faint mark suggested the recent presence of a chain, the locket that seemed so precious to her, gone without trace. Heavy footsteps approached from the corridor, and a large man with graying whiskers appeared in the doorway. His uniform marked him as the train's conductor, and his expression bore that particular gravity of one who has dealt with difficult situations before Musa. He introduced himself with a slight bow. I am told there has been a death in me carriage. I am Hercule Poirot, and this is my friend, Captain Hastings, Poirot replied. The young lady appears to have died during the night, most peacefully and would judge from appearances. Miss Busher stepped into the compartment and regarded the scene with professional composure. POV damn. She seemed in good health when she boarded at Kalala. No complaints of illness, no requests for assistance. Did you observe anything unusual during the night? Poirot asked. Any sounds? Any disturbances in this section of the carriage? The conductor considered carefully. There was some movement in the corridor around midnight. Passengers retiring, you understand, and later half round. Perhaps around 3 o'clock I heard footsteps, but this is not unusual. Submits. Passengers cannot sleep, they walk. To settle their nerves be. Now word of the tragedy had begun to spread, and I could hear whispered conversations from the neighboring compartments. The atmosphere of the carriage had changed entirely from the peace filming I had awakened to replaced by that peculiar tension that death brings to a confined space. Pool completed his examination of the scene, his eyes lingering on details that seemed significant to me. The arrangement of Miss Lee's personal belongings, the precise positioning of her traveling case, the way her coat hung on its hooked. Authorities in London must be notified. Major Busher said, we arrive at Victoria Station in 2 hours. Indeed, agreed, but until then, it would be wise to disturb nothing in this compartment. He stepped back into the corridor and surveyed the gathered passengers who had begun to emerge from their berths, drawn by the unusual activity. Mockingbird. She will not sing again, he murmured, his voice carrying that note of melancholy I had learned to associate with his encounters with mortality. But perhaps she has already told us her song. The words seemed to hang in the air as the train continued its relentless progress toward London, carrying with it a mystery that had transformed our comfortable night, crossing into something far more complex and troubling. Chapter 3. Fellow Travelers. Chapter 3. Fellow Travelers. News of Miss Lee's death had spread through the carriage with a peculiar efficiency that tragic events possess in confined spaces. By 9 o'clock, as we approached the outskirts of London, the remaining passengers had gathered in the dining car at M.C. Bouchard's request. The conductor, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, had suggested that everyone remain together until the authorities could could board at Victoria Station. I found myself studying our fellow travelers with new interest, knowing that one among them might possess crucial information about the events of the previous night. Poirot sat beside me. His demeanor went awfully to tension though. I detected that familiar alertness in his posture that suggested his little gray cells were already hard at work. The most distinguished member of our group was undoubtedly Professor Otto Linderman, who occupied the seat opposite us with the careful precision of a man accustomed to lecture halls and academic formalities. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with steel gray hair and intelligent blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Hands, I noticed, bore the telltale stains of one who worked regularly with plant specimens, a most unfortunate occurrence. The professor remarked in accented, excellent English. I was not acquainted with the young lady naturally, but she appeared to be in good health when I observed her boarding at Kalala. You noticed, Miss Lee, particularly? Poirot inquired with that deceptively casual tone I knew so well. Professor Linderman jested. His spectacles, one observes, fellow passengers. Does one not, especially a young woman traveling alone? In my country, we consider it's proper to take note of such things for their protection. You understand, most commendable Poirot murmured. In your own journey, Professor, business or pleasure research? Primarily, I have been studying Mediterranean flora for my work at the University of Munich. Quite fascinating, the adaptation of species to different climates. His manner grew more animated as he spoke of his specialty. I carry several specimens back to Germany. It's all properly documented, of course. Noticed a slight tension in his voice when he mentioned documentation, though it seemed natural enough given the current political climate in Europe. Crossbar travel had become increasingly complicated in recent years. At the far end of our small group sat Lord Pembroke, a man whose very presence seemed to bring an air of drawing room, its elegance, to the utilitarian surroundings of the dining car. He was, perhaps, 45, with sort of polished good looks that spoke of Savile Row, tailoring, and regular exercise at an exclusive Clevis manner. Was one of easy charm, though. I detected something studied in his perfection. Dreadful business, he said, his voice carrying the particular inflection of Eton and Oxford. I do hope there's no suggestion of anything irregular. Poor girl looked rather frail to me, these working women. You know, often overt tax their constitutions, Sue, observed Miss Lee's profession. Puel asked. With interest, one could tell, couldn't one, the cut of her clothes, the way she carried herself, Gentile, but not quite. Well, you understand, Lord. Pembroke's smile was apologetic. Rather an eye for these things, family trait, I suppose. We've employed dozens of governors and companions over years. Miss Agatha Winters, who had been listening with apparent disapproval now, spoke up with characteristic directness. Nonsense. Lord Pembroke, that tomb woman, had quality written all over her. Whatever her circumstances might have been, Miss Winters was a formidable form, perhaps 55 years of age, with iron gray hair arranged in an uncompromisingly and sharp brown eyes that missed very little. Her traveling costume was expensive but practical, and she wore it with the confidence of one who would never need to consider the cost of her clothing. You have strong opinions about people, Miss Winters, Poirot observed pleasantly. I have strong opinions about everything, Mr. Poirot. It comes from having lived long enough to see through pretense, fixed Lord Pembroke with a meaningful look before continuing. That poor girl was troubled, but something, I could see it in her face, and I heard things during the night that suggest not everyone aboard this train slept peacefully. Odd sounds Hastings prompted, sensing the importance of her statement. Footsteps in the corridor, whispered conversations, people moving about when decent folks will be in their berths. Miss Winters's expression grew more severe. Traveled extensively, gentlemen, and I. Another difference between normal night sounds and something irregular. The anxious member of our group had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now all eyes turned to Timothy Ashford. He was perhaps 16, with the earnest bearing of a boy thrust prematurely into adult responsibilities. His school blazer was well made, sputtering signs of wear, and he clutched a telegram in his hands with an intensity that suggested its importance. "You heard nothing unusual, young man?" Poirot asked gently. Timothy's cheeks colored slightly. He was rather preoccupied with my own concerns. He held up the telegram. "Family matters, you understand, rather urgent. You travel alone to London?" "Yes, sir. My guardian arranged it. I'm to meet with his solicitor about." He hesitated. Ton seemed to gather courage about my background. "Actually, there are airy questions about my parentage that need resolving." An odd silence fell over the group at this revelation. I noticed Professor Linderman's hands tightened slightly on his coffee cup, while Lord Pembroke's expression became carefully neutral. Miss Winters, however, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Questions of parentage," she repeated. "How fascinating are you? Perhaps one." Aptos, war orphans, so many children were displaced during those terrible years. Timothy's color deepened. "Something of that nature. Yes, my guardian believes there have been irregularities in my adoption records that were misplaced or altered. A common enough occurrence," Professor Linderman observed quiet live. "War created many such tragic situations. Children separated from families' identities lost in the chaos." "Indeed," Lord Pembroke agreed, though his tone seemed forced. "Dreadful business war creates problems that persist for generations." Poirot had been listening to this exchange with particular attention, his head tilted slightly in the characteristic pose that indicated deep thought. I could sense his interest sharpening, though his expression remained one of polite sympathize. Train began to slow perceptibly, and through the windows we could see the outskirts of London taking shape through the morning haze. The atmosphere in the dining car had grown heavy with unspoken tensions, each passenger seeming lost in private contemplations that the tragedy had somehow awakened. As we approached Victoria Station, I found myself wondering what connections might exist between these seemingly desperate individuals and the quiet young woman who now lay still in compartment 7. The morning that had begun with such tragic simplicity was revealing layers of complexity that made me increasingly grateful for Poirot's presence and his remarkable ability to perceive patterns where others saw only coincidence. Chapter 4. Echoes from the Past. Chapter 4. Echoes from the Past. Train had come to its final stop at Victoria Station, but by arrangement with authorities, our carriage remained sealed, while Poirot conducted what had her a preliminary examination of Miss Lee's belongings. Inspector Bradley of Scotland Yard, a competent, unimaginative man whom we had encountered before, had granted this courtesy with the reluctant respect that Poirot's reputation commanded. I watched my friend work with his characteristic methodical precision, handling each item from Miss Lee's traveling case with the reverence due to clues that might speak for the dead. Her possessions were few but carefully chosen, quality items that spoke of refined taste operating within Modestine's regard. Hastings Poirot murmured, withdrawing a small leather portfolio from a cunningly concealed compartment in the bottom of her cassier. Miss Lee, she was not quite the simple governess she appeared to. Beatty portfolio contained documents that immediately commanded attention. There were letters bearing official seals, newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, and most significantly, a birth certificate that bore a name entirely different from the one under which she had been traveling. Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell. I read aloud, born 1915 in Surrey, but Poirot swooned. Make her 22 years of age, precisely, and observed the parents listed: Colonel James Hartwell and Lady Catherine Hartwell. Poirot's finger traced the elegant script. Not the background one would expect of a governess among thepapors, was a photograph that made my breath catch. It showed a young woman unmistakably Miss Lee, standing beside Eamon in military uniform. But it was not this that drew my attention so forcefully pinned to the woman's dressing. The photograph was a locket identical to the one that had been stolen from her body, the same Mockingbird design, he observed, studying the intricate engraving. But look here, Poirot, there's an inscription on the back, visible in the photograph. Poirot produced his magnifying glass and examined the image closely. For my darling birdie, may you always sing of hope, mother, 1918. Most illuminating mon ami birdie, I repeated, thoughtfully, a rather apt nickname for someone associated with mockingbirds indeed. But why would a young woman of good family travel under a false name, and why carry documents that suggest he paused, studying another yellowette, clipping but here we had the beginning of understanding. The newspaper cutting was from the Times dated 1918. The headline read, Hartwell family tragedy, daughter missing after Zeppelin raid. The brief article described how 3-year-old Margaret Hartwell had disappeared during a bombing attack on her family's estate. Despite extensive searches, no trace of the child had ever been found. But this is extraordinary, I exclaimed. If this is true, then Miss Hartwell was returning to reclaim her identity after nearly 20 years. Proceed, but such a return would pose certain complications for others, would it not? Poirot's eyes held that faraway look that indicated his mind was working several steps ahead of the visible evidence. A gentle knock interrupted our examination. Inspector Bradley's voice carried through the door. Mr. Poirot, I'm afraid I must ask you to conclude your examination. The passengers are becoming restless. Inspector Poirot called back, then turned to me with renewed urgency. Hastings, we must question our fellow travelers about their connections to 3 years, but carefully, most carefully indeed. We rejoined the group in the dining car where the atmosphere had grown increasingly strained. Professor Lindemann was consulting his pocket watch with obvious anxiety, while Lord Pembroke maintained his facade of polished calm, though I detected tension the way he drummed his fingers against the table. Forgive the delay. It's poor begging, pleasantly, but the examination of the poor young lady's effects has raised certain questions that perhaps you might help to clarify. Miss Winters looked up sharply. Questions? What sort of questions? Matters relating to the war years, Poirot replied. It appears that Miss Lee, or perhaps I should say Miss Hartwell, had connections to events from that period that may be relevant to her death. The effect of this revelation was immediate and telling. Professor Lindemann's face went quite pale, while Timothy Ashford brought his telegram with shaking hands. Lord Team Rook's composure cracked momentarily, revealing something approaching alarm. Before he recovered himself, Hartwell, Miss Winters, repeated a voice sharp with interest. Not the Surrey Hartwells. I remember the family dreadful business during the war. They lost their little daughter in a raid. You knew? The familiar Poirot asked, with deceptive casualness. Not personally, but one heard things society was smaller in those days. Miss Winters' expression grew thoughtful. There were rumors afterward about the adoption societies. So many displaced children, so much confusion about. Records. Professor Lindemann cleared his throat. Nervously. Fear. I know nothing of English families. My work during the war was purely academic botanical research for the government. Which government? Queried Gately. The professor's discomfort increased visibly. Initially, German naturally, but later circumstances became complicated. One had to make certain adjustments. Lord Pembroke shifted in his seat. I say this is all rather irregular, isn't it? The poor girl is dead. Does it matter what her real name was? On the contrary, Lord Pembroke's identity. It matters very much indeed, especially when that identity has been, shall we say, borrowed by others young. Timothy had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange. Mr. Poirot, he said hesitantly, do you think Miss Hartwell's case might be connected to 2 other irregularities in adoption records. It is entirely possible, young man telling your own concerns about parentage. Do they perhaps relate to the same? Peria Bear, Timothy, could answer Inspector. Bradley appeared in the doorway. Mr. Poirot, I really must insist. Of course, Inspector. But first, might I examine the travel incasses for our fellow passengers? Merely a formality, you understand. The suggestion created immediate tension. Professor Linderman protested about his botanical specimens, while Lord Pembroke questioned the legality of such a search. It was Miss Winters who settled the matter with characteristic directness. Oh, for heaven's sake, examine whatever you like, those with nothing to hide. Have nothing to fear. The search proceeded under Inspector Bradley's supervision, though. I noticed Poirot's particular attention to certain items. It was while examining Lord Pembroke's overnight case that his fingers paused at a monogrammed handkerchief. In the elaborate stitching of his family crest was a small but unmistakable detail. The delicate outlining of a mockingbird worked so skillfully into the design that it appeared to be merely decorative. A flourish. Poirot said nothing, but his eyes met mine with an expression of profound significance. 12 mockingbirds, now one missing with the dead woman's locket, and another hidden in plain sight among a living passenger's belongings. The implication sent a chill through me as I realized that our quiet train journey had become something far more complex and dangerous than a simple death from natural causes. Chapter V. The poison in the garden. Chapter 5. The poison in the garden. The discovery of the second mockingbird symbol had cast a new and sinister light over our investigation. Next, Bradley, though clearly out of his depth, had agreed to Poirot's request for a more thorough examination of Miss Hartwell's personal effects. We had withdrawn to an empty compartment that the railway officials had made available, leaving our fellow passengers under police supervision in the dining car. Hastings, Poirot said, quietly handling Miss Hartwell's dark traveling coat with infighting care. Observe how our poor victim chose to dress for her final journey. Everything about her apparatus calculated to be unremarkable. Yes, the plain coat, the simple dress, the midst traveling case. I watched as his fingers explored the coat's construction with the thoroughness of a trained seamstress looking for hidden pockets, secret compartments. No, mon ami. Looking for something far more sinister. His examination concentrated on the collar area where the fabric met a decorative trim of dark velvet. But what have we here? With infinite delicacy, he separated a section of thavo veil trim to reveal a tiny mechanism. Concealed within no larger than ashling, it consisted of what appeared to be a hollow needle attached to a small spring device. Good Lord, I exclaimed, leaning closer to examine the ingenious contraption. It's some sort of injection device, precisely designed to deliver a minute dose of something directly into the bloodstream. When the wearer moved in a particular way, Poirot's expression grew grave. Most cleverly conceived, the victim would feel nothing more than the sensation of her collar shifting against her neck. Inspector Bradley, who had been observing our examination with growing bewilderment, now stepped forward. Are you Miss Augustin? The young lady was murdered, Mr. Poirot. I am suggesting that appearances they can be most deceiving, Inspector, but to prove murder, we must first identify what substance was delivered by this device. It was at this moment that Professor Linderman's expertise became invaluable, though clearly against his wishes, when summoned to examine Poirot's discovery. The German scholar's face went ashen and his hands trembled as he essayed the mechanism through Poirot's magnifying glass. My God, he whispered, this is most ingenious and most deadly. You recognize the design? Professor Poole inquired with that deceptive mildness that always preceded crucial revelations. It the design specifically, but the purpose? Yes, during my research that East say during the war years, I encountered references to certain botanical extracts that could induce cardiac arrest, virtually undetectable in small doses, but requiring precise knowledge of dosage and delivery. What sort of botanical extracts, Inspector Bradley demanded, Professor. Linderman's discomfort was palpable. Compounds derived from certain Mediterranean plants, digitalis, variants primarily, but refined to concentrate cardiac effects. Such knowledge was researched by various governments. During the conflict, I found myself studying the professor with new suspicion. You seem remarkably well informed about assassination techniques. For simple botanist knowledge and application are quite different things, Captain Hastings, he replied stiffly. I was a researcher. Notin Assassin Poirot intervened before the tension could escalate further. Professor Sec, a poison would it require special storage, particular conditions to remain effective, indeed temperature control, protection from light, specific preservant solutions. The professor's academic interest momentarily overcame his nervousness. Not something one could carry casually in a traveling case. This revelation sent Inspector Bradley hurrying back to re-examine the passenger's belongings with a new purpose. Was during this search that young Timothy Ashford created the first significant alarm of our investigation. He had been observing the group in the dining car when the boy suddenly bolted from his seat, pushing past Miss Wintersand, making for the corridor. His face was pale with panic, and he clutched his mysterious telegram as if it contained his life's salvation. Stofian, Inspector Bradley called out, but Timothy had already disappeared into the maze of railway carriages beyond our section. The pursuit that followed was brief but illuminating. We found Timothy huddled in the storage compartment, 3 cars down, tears streaming down his young face as he pressed himself into the darkest corner. I didn't mean any harm, he sobbed as Inspector Bradley gently coaxed him out. I just couldn't bear the questions anymore. The telegram, it's not what I told you it was. Back in the dining car, under Poirot's gentle questioning, the truth emerged. Monthes's telegram was not from a guardian solicitor, but from a private investigator. His deceased foster mother had hired to trace his real parentage. She left me money for the search. Timothy explained, his voice barely above a whisper, said there were things of beauty adoption that weren't quite right, records that had been all tried, payments made to the wrong people. When did this investigation begin? Post with particular interest. 3 months ago, the investigator found evidence that several children adopted through the same agency during the war years had false documentation. Arranged for me to meet with other affected families in London. Miss Wintershad been listening with sharp attention. Other families, how many others? At least a dozen that he'd identified, all adopted between 1917 and 1920, all with suspicious gaps in their documentation. Timothy's voice grew stronger as Heck continued. He said there was evidence of a systematic operation stealing children from wealthy families and selling them to couples desperate for adoption. Implications of this revelation settled over our group like a cold fog. I found myself studying Lord Pembroke with increasing suspicion, remembering the Mockingbird hidden in his family crescent. His earlier nervousness about Miss Hartwell's true identity. Pembroke, I murmured to Pooh when we had a moment alone. He knew about the Hartwell family. His reaction when you mentioned the name was telling. Indeed, mon ami, but we must be cautious about hasty conclusions in a case such as this. The obvious suspect may be merely another victim of clever misdirection. War's warning proved prescient, for as Inspector Bradley continued his systematic search of the passenger spellings, we discovered that Professor Linderman carried far more than botanical specimens in his carafolibelled cases. Hidden among the plant samples were vials of preserved extractional laboratory apparatus, and most damning of all, a notebook filled with detailed formulas for cardiac poisons. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows of Victoria Station as our investigation took on an increasingly complex character. What had begun as a simple death aboard a night train was revealing connections to wartime crimes, stolen identities, and a web of guilt that seemed to entangle every passenger in our small confined world. The Mockingbird song, it appeared, had been silenced to prevent the revelation of secrets that stretched back nearly 20 years into the chaos and opportunity of Great War. Chapter 6, Masks and Mirrors. Chapter 5. Masks and mirrors. Afternoon shadows were lengthening across Victoria Station's platforms when Inspector Bradley returned from his telephone consultation with his superiors at Scotland Yard. His expression bore the particular strain of a man caught between official pressure and the complications of an increasingly complex Hercule Poirot. He began with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid the yard is pressing for a solution. The station authorities are eager to clear the carriage, and there are questions about detaining passengers with formal charges." Poirot nodded gravely. "I understand the pressures, Inspector, but rushing to judgment in such a case would be most unwise. Already, we have discoveries that suggest the careful planning of a sophisticated mind." It was at this moment that Lord Pembroke's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. In earnest, Inspector Bradley had taken Poirot's advice to verify each passenger's stated movements during the crucial hours, and the results were proving most illuminating. "Your Lordship, Inspector," Bradley addressed him with formal politeness, "I've been checking your statement about retiring directly to your compartment after dinner. The steward on duty recalls seeing you in the corridor. Much Latathon." You indicated Lord Pembroke's composure faltered visibly. Well, perhaps I was mistaken about the exact time. One loses track aboard trains, doesn't one? The steward was quite specific. Inspector Bradley continued relentlessly. "He saw you near Miss Hartwell's compartment at approximate limit. You appeared to be listening at her door." "That's preposterous." Lord Pembroke's voice rose with indignation, but I detected the hollow ring of panic beneath his bluster. "I may have walked at the corridor to settle my nerves, but I certainly wasn't spying on fellow passengers." Miss Winters, who had been observing this exchange with sharp attention, now leaned forward with the decisive air of one who had reached a conclusion. "I can corroborate the steward's account," she declared firmly. "I heard voices in the corridor around that time, a man's voice speaking in urgent whispers, and later, much later, I heard footsteps running past my compartment." "What time was this second occurrence?" Poole asked with keen interest. "Past 3 o'clock. I should say I'm a light sleeper, and these sound woke me completely. Heavy footsteps. Trying to move quietly, but not quite succeeding." Professor Lindemann shifted uncomfortably in his set. "Evie. Footsteps, you say? That would eliminate myself and the young man. Surely we are neither of us large." Miss Winters fixed him with a calculating stare. "Professor, you may not be large, but you wear those heavy German walking boots. I noticed them yesterday evening, quite distinctive, with metal reinforcements in the heels." The professor's face flushed high, as they are practical for field work. "But I assure you, I did not leave my compartment during the night yet. Your own admission about the botanical poisons suggests you had both means and opportunity," Inspector Bradley observed, "and your obvious nervousness about border crossings indicates you may have had other reasons for avoiding attention." He watched Poirot carefully during these exchanges, noting how his attention seemed to focus not on the accusations fall, but on the reactions they provoked among the other passengers. Timothy Ashford appeared particularly distressed, clutching his telegram and shifting nervously in his seat. "Professor Lindemann," Poirot said quietly, "perhaps you would explain why you carry such an extensive collection of cardiac poisons if your research is purely chemic." The German scholar's composure finally cracked entirely. Very well. Yes, I admit it. I was involved in research of a sensitive nature, during war, chemical compounds, biological agents, but not for assassination, for medical purposes, developing antidotes, understanding dosages for treatments, Miss Winters repeated skeptically, or elimination. You do not understand the pressures of wartime research, Professor. Linneman's voice boils with desperation. One does what one must to survive, to protect one's family. I never harmed anyone directly. Never. Lord Pembroke seemed to seize upon this admission as deflection from his own difficulties. There you have it. Inspector Othello admits to working with poisons, and his behavior tonight has been suspicious from the start. Here is the hand for silence. If I may, I believe we are beginning to see the outline of what occurred, through not yet the complete picture. He began to pace the small confines of the dining car with that measured stride that indicated his mind was arranging facts into patterns. Consider, if you please, the sequence of events. Miss Hartwell, for we must call her by her true name, boards the train carrying evidence of a wartime scandal she carries with her. Proof that could destroy the carefully constructed lives of those involved in a legal adoption. Timothy Ashford's face. One white, you'd think she was killed to prevent exposure, would appear logical? Yes, someone aboard this train had reason to feel wet. Miss Hartwell's investigation might reveal someone with connections to the adoption scandal who stood to loss of writing. If the truth emerged, Inspector Bradley nodded slowly, and the poison device in her coat suggests premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion, but careful planning, Hercule Poirot agreed. But here we encounter our first difficulty, the timing it. Is Miss curious if Miss Hartwell's killer wished to silence her permanently? Why wait until she was aboard the train? Why not eliminate her before she could gather evidence? This question seemed to puzzle everyone present, including myself. The logic of it was troubling. If someone had wanted to prevent Miss Hartwell's investigation, surely they would have acted sooner. Lord Pembroke suggested, his voice carefully controlled. She only recently discovered something particularly damaging, something that required immediate action. Or perhaps Miss Winters had it grimly. The killer only learned of her investigation when they encountered her aboard the train. A chance meeting turned deadly. Poole considered these possibilities with his characteristic source. Both theories have merit, but they both depend upon certain assumptions that may prove incorrect. His gaze swept across our assembled group. For instance, we assumed that Miss Hartwell was the victim of this crime, but what if she was merely an obstacle? A different objective entirely. The implications of this suggestion sent a chill through the compartment. If Miss Hartwell's death was incidental to some larger scheme, then everything we had assumed about motive, pit, and method might be completely wrong. As the afternoon light continued to fade through the windows of Victoria Station, I found myself studying each face around me with new uncertainty. Masks of civility and respectability that we all wore seemed suddenly fragile, concealing depths of desperation and guilt that made our confined railway carriage feel less like a sanctuary than a trap. Somewhere among us sat a killer. His careful planning had been disguised as natural death, and whose true motives remained as elusive as shadows. In the gathering darkness, Chapter 7. When Identity Crumbles. Chapter 7. When identity crumbles, late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of our makeshift investigation room as Poirot began what T recognized as his systematic dismantling of false solutions. Had that particular air of quiet concentration that always preceded his most brilliant deductions, and I found myself watching our fellow passengers with growing tension as the net of legit tightened around the truth. Let us examine, if you please, the evidence as it presents itself. Poirot began, his hands clasped behind his back in characteristic pose. We have established that Miss Margaret Hartwell died from a carefully administered poison delivered by an ingenious device concealed in her coat, we know that she carried evidence of wartime adoption irregularities, and that the locket, now missing, contained proof of her true identity. Inspector Bradley nodded impatiently. Yes, we've established all that would need is to identify the killer patient's Inspector. The method of elimination, it reveals as much as the method of inclusion. Poirot's gaze moved systematically across our group. First, let us consider Professor Lindemann, the German scholar, stiffened visibly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with white knuckles. The professor, he has knowledge of poisons. Yes, he possesses means to create such a device. But observe the fatal flaw in this solution, Tylene. Professor Linderman's botanical cases were thoroughly inspected at Kalala by customs officials. He could not have concealed a prepared poison device without detection. Professor Lindeman's relief was palpable. Exactly, the French authorities examined every specimen. Every vial. Such scrutiny would have revealed any concealed mechanism. Further, Poirot continued, the professor's reaction to our discoveries has been that of genuine shock, not the careful calculation of a prepared murderer. He is guilty of wartime activities that trouble his conscience, but not of this particular crime. Lord Pembroke straightened in his seat, clearly hoping for similar exoneration. There, you see, I told you the German fellow was suspicious from the start. But Lord Pembroke, your own situation requires careful examination. Poirot's tone grew more serious. You were seen near Miss Hartwell's compartment at the crucial time. You possessed knowledge of adoption irregularities, and most significantly, you carry among your belongings a Mockingbird symbol. That connects you directly to this case. I can explain that, Lord Pembroke said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. Family crests often incorporate various symbols. It means nothing. On the contrary, it means a great deal, but not what one might initially suppose. Poirot paused, studying Lord Pembroke with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see into men's souls. The presence near Miss Hartwell's compartment was not that of a killer, but of a victim. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I found myself leaning forward, struggling to follow Poirot's reasoning. A victim. Inspector Bradley repeated. What do you mean, Lord Pembroke? You were adopted as a child, were you not? During the war. Your swan records were flexible. Lord Pembroke's facade crumbled entirely. How could you possibly know that the Mockingbird in your family crest, it was added after your adoption as a symbol of your new identity? But Miss Hartwell's investigation threatened to expose the truth about your parentage. You went to her compartment, not to harm her, but to plead with her for discretion. To wouldn't lessen. Lord Pembroke whispered. His voice broke and said, too many families had suffered that the truth had to come out, regardless of the consequences. To people like me, Miss Winters, have been listening with growing understanding. Then you're one of the stolen children, one of those taken from their real families and sold to the highest bid. And the adopted parents believed they were saving an orphan. Lord Pembroke said desperately. They had no idea of the deception involved when they died and left me the title. I thought the secret was buried forever. Timothy Ashford spoke up quietly. She offered to help me find my real family. Miss Hartwell said she wasn't seeking revenge. She wanted justice. She wanted to reunite people with their true identities. Professor Poirot agreed. Miss Hartwell's mission was not vengeance, but restoration. A locket content, not merely proof of her own identity, but documentation that could help dozens of stolen children find their way home. Then why was she killed? Inspector Bradley demanded. I for mission was benevolent. Poirot's expression grew. Brimbaco's inspector. There was someone aboard this train whose entire existence depended upon keeping those secrets buried. Someone whose crime was not merely participating in the adoption scandal, but profiting from it continuously for 20 years. I felt a chill of understanding beginning to form. You mean Someone how isn't just a victim of the scandal, but one of its architects, exactly Hastings and me, who has lived a carefully constructed life for so long. Tate exposure would mean not merely embarrassment, but complete destruction. The atmosphere in the compartment had grown electric with tension. I found myself studying each face around me with new suspicion, wondering who among us had maintained such an elaborate deception. Decades Poole continued his relentless logic. This person knew that Miss Hartwell's locket contained evidence that would expose not just the adoption scandal, but their own central role in it. They could not allow her to reach London alive, but who miss? Winters demanded, "You've eliminated the professor and Lord Pembroke. That leaves only young Timothy and myself. And the boy clearly has been as much a victim as anyone," Inspector Bradley observed, which would suggest he turned to stare at Miss Winters. But Poirot raised a warning hand. "Careful, Inspector. We must not allow logic to trap us into hasty conclusions. The truth, it is often hidden in the most unexpected places." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside our compartment. Voice escaled out in alarm, and the sound of running footsteps echoed through the carriage. Inspector Bradley rushed to investigate, returning moments later with an expression of grim urgency. "Of the railway porters has been found unconscious in the baggage car," he reported, "and several pieces of luggage have been disturbed. It appears someone has been conducting their own search of the passengers' belongings." The implications sent a wave of cold fear through our confined group. The killer, realizing that Poirot's investigation was closing in, had taken desperate action to retrieve or destroy evidence. In the growing shadows of the railway carriage, the deadly game that had begun with Miss Hartwell's quiet death was entering its most dangerous phase. Chapter 8. It's the last song. Chapter 8. The last song. The attack on the railway porter had galvanized Inspector Bradley into action. Within minutes, he had positioned constables at every exit from our carriage and recalled all passengers to the dining car. The late afternoon light, filtering through the windows, cast an appropriately dramatic atmosphere as Paul prepared to unveil the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of deception and careful misdirection. "Dame, see Monsieur Poirot," began his voice, carrying that peculiar authority that always marked his moments of revelation. "We are gathered here to discover not merely who killed Miss Margaret Hartwell, but why such a gentle soul had to defer the sins of the past." He began to pace with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose from the beginning of this case. Has been about identity, stolen identities, false identities, and the desperate need to preserve a carefully constructed life built upon deception. Timothy Ashford leaned forward eagerly. "Then you know who killed her enduring man. But first, let me explain how this tragedy came to pass." Pugh's gaze swept across our assembled group. Miss Hartwell was not merely investigating gaudy irregularities. She was seeking to expose an organized criminal enterprise that operated during the cows of the Great War. Professor Lindemann shifted uncomfortably. "Speak of systematic child theft. Praise them all, Professor, but not Therendum, taking of orphaned children. No, this was far more sophisticated. This was the deliberate identification of wealthy families who had lost children in the war's confusion and the subsequent sale of suitable substitutes to desperate couples seeking adoption." The horror of this revelation settled over our group like a physical weight. I found myself studying Miss Winters. Hope had grown remarkably still and quiet during Poirot's explanations. Operation required several key elements, Poirot continued. First, someone with access to society circles who could identify vulnerable families, scansamine with legal or administrative connections, who could falsify documentation. And third, someone with thirstlessness to separate children from their families for profit. Inspector Bradley nodded grimly. A conspiracy involving multiple participants in Miss Hartwell's investigation, threatened to expose them all. Her locket content not merely proof of her own stolen identity, but evidence of the entire network: names, dates, payments, a complete record of 20 years of criminal activity. Lord Pembroke found his voice, but surely such records would have been destroyed long ago. But that assumes rational behavior from criminals, mon ami. In reality, such records often survive because they represent power leverage over those who participated. Insurance against betrayal. Poirot's eyes found Miss Winters. Is it not so, Miss Winters? The transformation in Miss Winters was remarkable. The sharp-tongued, retrospectable spinster seemed to dissolve before our eyes, replaced by Samia Nayagaga. Or dangerous, her posture straightened, her expression hardened, and when she spoke, her voice carried a cold authority I had never heard before. You're very clever, Mr. Poirot. Too clever for your own good. Perhaps you kept records of every transaction. Poirot continued implacably. Every child sold, every family deceived, every payment made. Such information was valuable. Attention, cooperation from your network, and provided income through careful blackmail for decades. Families got what they wanted, Miss Winters said, with chilling pragmatism. Children to love and raise the adoptive parents were grateful. Where was the harm to Monty? Ashford's voice shook with emotion. The harm was to the real families, Topopel, like Miss Hartwell, who spent their lives wondering who they really were as its mates. Miss Winters dismissed coldly. The war created chaos. I simply brought it to it, and Prophet Hero nodded gravely. And when Miss Hartwell began her investigation, he realized you're carefully constructed. Life was threatened. You discovered her true identity when she boarded the train, recognized her from the photographs you kept of your victims. She was supposed to be dead, Miss Winters said with remarkable calm. The raid on the Hartwell estate was carefully timed. I had arranged for little Margaret to be rescued and sold to a family in America when she vanished shadowing the bombing. I assumed she had died as planned. The casual way she spoke of planning a child's death sent shivers through our confined group. Inspector Bradley's hand moved instinctively toward his handcuffs, but she survived. Poirot, sinews hidden by well-meaning servants who feared the truth of her disappearance, and 20 years later, she returned to claim her heritage and expose your crimes. I couldn't allow that, Miss Winters said. Simply too many people would have been destroyed by the revelations. Important people, powerful families who had built their lives on my arrangements. So you killed her, Inspector Bradley said with disgust. Poisoned her like a rat. I protected the innocent, Miss Winters corrected. The poison device was a simple matter to conceal in her coat while she slept. A gentle death, really far more merciful than the alternative. And you stole her locket to destroy the evidence it contained. Added, finally, understanding the complete picture, evidence that would have ruined dozens of families. Miss Winters confirmed. Children who had grown to love their adoptive parents, parents who had raised stolen children as their own. Was that justice, Mr. Poirot? Justice, madame, is not yours to dispense or throw. Murder, Poirot replied with quiet dignity. Miss Hartwell sought not revenge but reconciliation. She wanted to reunite families, to heal old wounds, not to punish those who had unknowingly participated in your schemes. The fight seemed to go out of Miss Winters at these words. Wouldn't listen to reason. I tried to explain the complications, the pain, that exposure, but she was determined to reveal everything, and saw you silenced the Mockingbird before it could sing its song of truth. Poirot said sadly, but truth, madame, has a way of emerging despite our efforts to bury it. Inspector Bradley moved forward with hissing cuffs. Miss Agatha Winters, I arrest you for the murder of Margaret Hartwell. You are not obliged to say anything further, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. As the constables led Miss Winters away, her composure finally cracked. You don't understand," she called out desperately. "I gave those children better lives. I helped families who were desperate for children. I brought happiness, but there was only loss." The dining car fell silent after her departure, the weight of revealed truth settling over us like a shroud. Young Timothy Ashford sat quietly weeping, whether for Miss Hartwell or for his own lost identity. I could not say Poirot moved to the window. The authorities cleared the carriage for a final departure from Victoria Station. Evening lights of London were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, and the great city seemed to compromise both sanctuary and the hope of justice. Finally served the Mockingbird. He murmured, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the station. She sang her last song after Allet. Perhaps, in the end, it was the most important song of all, the song of truth that cannot be silenced forever, no matter how many are tried to still its voice as our long day's journey finally came to its close. I reflected on the tragic irony that Miss Hartwell had died just hours before reaching the city, where she hoped to find justice for herself and others like her. But perhaps Pooh was right. Perhaps her death had indeed ensured that the truth would emerge, and that the Mockingbird song would continue to echo long after the singer herself had been Solange Tautre. Thanks for joining me for When the Mockingbird Falls. Did you suspect Miss Winters before Poirot revealed how she operated the adoption scandal for 20 years, concealed the poison device in Miss Hartwell's coat collar, and still locked it to destroy evidence of her crimes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey with Hercule Poirot, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, this is Signing Off from Stories Cafe.